Whitney Houston watched Diana Ross perform and learned lessons that would shape Whitney's entire career. Learned that perfection was non-negotiable. Learned that image control mattered more than authenticity. Learned that being the greatest meant accepting no equals. Learned that vulnerability was weakness and strength meant never letting audiences see you struggle. Whitney absorbed those lessons completely. And those same lessons that helped Whitney become a superstar eventually contributed to Whitney's destruction. Some of y'all remember Whitney Houston as the voice of a generation. Remember "I Will Always Love You" and "Greatest Love of All." Remember Super Bowl 1991 and that national anthem that made grown people cry. Remember Whitney as perfection incarnate, beautiful, talented, polished, untouchable. That version of Whitney was built partly on Diana Ross's blueprint, and that blueprint was poison disguised as success strategy. Diana Ross was Whitney's template for Black female superstardom. Not a personal mentor, Diana and Whitney weren't close friends or collaborators, but Diana's career path became the model Whitney followed. Solo superstar status, crossover appeal to white audiences, meticulous image control, distance from anything too black, too raw, too real, the glossy perfection that made mainstream America comfortable. Whitney studied Diana's success and replicated the formula, and it worked brilliantly until it didn't. The lessons Whitney learned from watching Diana weren't explicitly taught. Diana never sat Whitney down and said, "Here's how you become a superstar." But the lessons were there in Diana's choices, Diana's presentation, Diana's carefully constructed public persona. Be flawless, never show weakness, maintain control at all costs, prioritize image over truth, choose career over personal relationships, accept loneliness as the price of greatness. Whitney absorbed all of it. Whitney's team, particularly Clive Davis at Arista Records, reinforced these lessons. Clive had watched Motown's strategy with Diana, understood that crossover success required presenting Black talent in ways that didn't threaten white audiences. Clive applied that same approach to Whitney. Carefully selected songs that were soulful but not too Black, created an image that was glamorous but not too sexual, positioned Whitney as America's sweetheart rather than as a Black woman with complexity and edges. Some of y'all watched Whitney's rise in the 1980s and felt complicated emotions. Pride that a Black woman was achieving unprecedented mainstream success, but also concerned about what Whitney had to suppress to achieve it. Concerned about the glossy perfection that seemed to require Whitney to be less authentically herself. Concerned that the same patterns that had limited Diana were being replicated with Whitney. And those concerns proved justified. The perfection Whitney projected came at enormous psychological cost. Whitney couldn't be messy, couldn't be complicated, couldn't show struggle. Had to maintain a flawless image even when Whitney's personal life was chaotic. Had to perform happiness even when Whitney was miserable. Had to be America's sweetheart even when Whitney wanted to be something raw and more real. The gap between public image and private reality created unbearable pressure. Diana had lived with that same gap for decades, had maintained Miss Ross' perfection while dealing with personal struggles privately, had smiled through pain, performed through exhaustion, protected the image at all costs. Diana survived it, though at significant personal cost. But Diana was trained for it from age 15 by Berry Gordy. Whitney adopted the same approach without that training, without that foundation. Whitney tried to be Diana Ross without the decades of preparation Diana had. The substance abuse that would eventually kill Whitney started as a way to manage the pressure, started as a way to be perfect in public while falling apart in private, started as a way to maintain the image while numbing the pain of maintaining it. This wasn't Diana's fault. Whitney made her own choices, but the blueprint Whitney followed, the model of perfection Whitney tried to embody, created conditions where those choices became more likely. Some of y'all understand how trying to be perfect destroys you, how maintaining an image that doesn't match your reality creates unbearable psychological pressure, how success achieved by suppressing your authentic self feels hollow even as you achieve it. Whitney learned from Diana that being the greatest required that kind of suppression, and that lesson was toxic. But what specific lessons did Whitney absorb, and how did they play out? The first lesson Whitney learned from Diana was that image control was everything. Diana's career demonstrated that carefully managing public perception mattered more than artistic authenticity. Diana chose roles, songs, appearances based on how they would affect Diana's image. Whitney adopted the same approach. Turned down film roles that would complicate her America's sweetheart image. Avoided songs that were too raw or controversial. Maintained careful distance from anything that might threaten the polished perfection. Whitney's rejection of too black material became infamous. Whitney was criticized for not being black enough, for making music that felt calculated for white audiences. Whitney defended those choices, but the criticism hurt. Created tension between Whitney's commercial success and Whitney's relationship with black communities who felt Whitney had chosen crossover appeal over cultural authenticity. Diana had faced similar criticism, had been accused of being too polished, too white-friendly, not soulful enough. Diana handled it by ignoring critics and focusing on commercial success. Whitney tried the same approach with less success. Some of y'all remember the criticism Whitney faced. Remember feeling conflicted about loving Whitney's music while wishing Whitney would be more authentically black. Remember the jokes about Whitney being white, even though Whitney was clearly talented. Remember how that criticism seemed to wound Whitney in ways it never seemed to wound Diana. The difference was that Diana had Berry Gordy's training, making her impervious to criticism. Whitney absorbed criticism and internalized it. The second lesson was that perfection was non-negotiable. Diana's performances were flawless. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect choreography, perfect vocals. No mistakes allowed, no vulnerability shown. Whitney replicated that perfectionism. Whitney's performances were technically perfect, but sometimes emotionally distant. The perfection created a barrier between Whitney and audiences, made Whitney seem untouchable rather than relatable, made Whitney's eventual struggles more shocking because the perfect image left no room for human complexity. The pressure to maintain perfection became crushing. Whitney couldn't have an off night, couldn't perform with a cold, couldn't be anything less than extraordinary because the image required it. Diana had managed that pressure by being almost superhuman in her discipline. Whitney wasn't superhuman. Whitney was human, struggling with human problems, trying to maintain inhuman standards. The gap between what was required and what Whitney could sustain created the conditions for collapse. The third lesson was that personal relationships were secondary to career. Diana had sacrificed relationships for success, had chosen solo career over the Supremes, had let friendships dissolve when they conflicted with career advancement, had accepted loneliness as the price of being supreme. Whitney learned that lesson too. Whitney's marriage to Bobby Brown happened when Whitney was already established and struggling with the isolation success had created. The relationship was complicated and often toxic, but it represented Whitney's attempt to have something real in a life that felt increasingly performative. Some of y'all watched Whitney's marriage become tabloid fodder, watched critics blame Bobby for Whitney's struggles, but the truth was more complicated. Whitney was already struggling with the cost of perfection before Bobby. Bobby didn't create Whitney's problems. He was part of Whitney's attempt to escape them, to have someone who knew the messy, imperfect Whitney rather than just the polished public version. Diana had avoided that kind of relationship during peak career years, had kept people at distance. Whitney tried the same approach and found it unsustainable. The fourth lesson was that vulnerability was weakness. Diana rarely showed authentic emotion publicly, controlled her image so tightly that even moments of apparent vulnerability felt calculated. Whitney tried that same control, But Whitney was more naturally emotional, more openly feeling than Diana. The suppression of that authentic emotion created internal conflict. Whitney was trying to be someone she wasn't, following a blueprint designed for Diana's personality, not Whitney's. The substance abuse that developed served multiple functions: numbed the pain of maintaining impossible standards, provided escape from constant performance, allowed Whitney to feel something real in a life that felt increasingly artificial, was a form of self-medication for the psychological cost of trying to be perfect. Diana had managed without that escape, had channeled everything into career, into control, into maintaining the image. Whitney couldn't do that, needed something to make the pressure bearable. Some of y'all have watched people try to live up to impossible standards, have seen how perfectionism becomes destructive, have witnessed substance abuse as a attempted solution to unbearable pressure. Whitney's story isn't unique. It's the story of many people who adopted success strategies that required suppressing their authentic selves. What made it tragic was Whitney's extraordinary talent being destroyed by the very strategies that had made success possible. The irony is that Diana's blueprint worked for Diana partly because Diana was uniquely suited to it. Diana's personality, controlled, ambitious, emotionally guarded, aligned with what the blueprint required. Diana could be Miss Ross without it destroying her, because being Miss Ross wasn't fundamentally different from who Diana was. But Whitney's personality was different. Whitney was warmer, more openly emotional, more naturally vulnerable. Trying to be Diana Ross when you're Whitney Houston created internal conflict that became unbearable. Some of y'all recognize this pattern, trying to succeed using someone else's blueprint rather than finding your own path, taking advice that works for one person and assuming it will work for you, adopting strategies that require you to suppress your authentic self. Whitney's tragedy was partly that Whitney followed a success model designed for someone with a different personality, different strengths, different capacity for emotional suppression. The public didn't understand what was happening as Whitney's struggles became visible in the early 2000s. Saw Whitney's decline in performances, erratic behavior, visible weight loss, blamed Bobby Brown, blamed drugs, blamed Whitney's choices. But the root cause was deeper. Whitney was collapsing under the weight of maintaining an image that had never truly fit. The glossy perfection had been performance from the beginning, and Whitney couldn't sustain the performance anymore. Diana watched Whitney's decline from the distance, never publicly commented on Whitney's struggles, maintained the same silence about Whitney that Diana maintained about most topics that might complicate Diana's image. But Diana had to see the parallels, see her own blueprint being followed to destructive conclusion, had to recognize that what had worked for Diana wasn't universally applicable, had to wonder, even privately, whether the model of success Diana embodied was actually healthy for anyone. Whitney's death in 2012 shocked the world, but probably shouldn't have. Whitney had been visibly struggling for years. The warning signs were obvious. But the public kept expecting Whitney to return to the perfect version, kept wanting the Whitney from 1991, not the messy, complicated human Whitney had always been underneath the image. The inability to accept Whitney's humanity, the same inability that had created the pressure requiring perfection, continued until Whitney died trying to be something she couldn't sustain. Some of y'all grieved Whitney's death deeply. Grieved not just the loss of extraordinary talent, but the tragedy of watching someone destroy themselves trying to maintain impossible standards. Grieved for what Whitney might have been if Whitney had been allowed to be imperfect, messy, authentically herself. Grieved for the cost of the Diana Ross blueprint when applied to someone it didn't fit. Diana's response to Whitney's death was carefully worded statement expressing sadness, not the deep reflection some hoped for, not acknowledgement that the model Diana represented might have toxic elements. just professional sadness from one legend about another's passing. Diana probably felt more than the statement suggested, but expressing complicated emotions publicly would have required vulnerability Diana has spent 80 years avoiding. The lessons Whitney learned from Diana weren't intentionally harmful. Diana wasn't trying to hurt anyone by being who she was. Diana was surviving in an industry that demanded perfection from Black women, that punished vulnerability, that rewarded image control. Diana developed strategies that worked for survival and success. Those strategies became a blueprint others followed. But survival strategies for one person can be poison for someone else. The tragedy isn't that Diana existed or succeeded. Diana's success was important, groundbreaking, valuable. The tragedy is that Diana's path became the template for Black female superstardom without acknowledgement of its costs, without recognition that what Diana could sustain, others might not be able to, without understanding that success strategies requiring suppression of authentic self eventually destroy most people who try them. Some of y'all have followed someone else's success blueprint and found it didn't work for you, have tried to be what someone else was and lost yourself in the process, have adopted strategies that required suppressing your authentic nature and paid psychological costs. Whitney's story is extreme, but the pattern is common. The lesson is that what works for one person's success might be another person's destruction. Whitney Houston deserved to be Whitney Houston, not a version of Diana Ross. Deserved space to be imperfect, complicated, authentically herself. Deserved success that didn't require constant performance of impossible perfection. But the industry that created Diana's blueprint and the culture that rewarded it didn't allow for that. Whitney tried to be what was expected and died trying. That's the real lesson, not about Diana specifically, but about the cost of success models requiring people to be anything other than themselves. Diana Ross is 80 years old now. Survived the industry, survived the pressure, survived 60 years of maintaining impossible standards. Diana's survival doesn't mean the blueprint was healthy. It means Diana had unique capacity to endure it. Whitney Houston died at 48, unable to sustain what Diana sustained. That difference tells us something important about individual variation, about how the same strategies affect different people differently. The question isn't whether Diana should have been different. Diana made choices that worked for Diana. Diana survived and succeeded. But should Diana's path have become the template for all Black female superstars? Should Whitney have been expected to follow it? Should the industry have learned from Whitney's death that one-size-fits-all blueprints for success are dangerous? Those are the real questions. Some of y'all have complex feelings about Diana's legacy after Whitney's death, can admire Diana's success while recognizing its cost to others, can appreciate Diana's groundbreaking achievements while acknowledging the blueprint shouldn't be universal, can hold both truths. Diana's success matters, and the model of success Diana represents can be toxic. Human beings contain contradictions. Legacy can too. The entertainment industry hasn't fundamentally changed since Whitney's death. Still rewards perfection, still punishes vulnerability, still expects Black female performers to maintain impossible standards, still creates conditions where substance abuse becomes coping mechanism for unbearable pressure. Beyoncé navigates this by being extraordinarily disciplined, more like Diana than Whitney. But Beyoncé also shows strategic vulnerability in ways Diana never did. Lemonade was rawness Diana would never have allowed. Maybe that's learning from Whitney's tragedy. Maybe that's evolution. Diana will never publicly acknowledge that her blueprint had toxic elements, would require vulnerability Diana doesn't do, would require admitting that success strategies Diana used might have contributed to another legend's death,
would require complexity in how Diana thinks about her own legacy. Diana probably can't do that. The identity Diana built over 80 years doesn't allow for that kind of reflection.
Whitney's legacy includes extraordinary talent and tragic waste, includes the voice of a generation and cautionary tale about perfectionism's costs, includes joy Whitney brought millions and pain Whitney endured maintaining impossible standards. Whitney's story should have changed how the industry approaches Black female talent, should have prompted reflection on what success models require and whether those requirements are sustainable. But mostly, it hasn't. The machine keeps demanding perfection, keeps punishing authenticity, keeps creating conditions for the next tragedy. Some of y'all wonder what Whitney could have been with a different blueprint. If Whitney had been allowed to be messy, imperfect, authentically herself from the beginning. If success hadn't required suppressing so much of who Whitney was. If the industry had valued Whitney's humanity as much as Whitney's voice. We'll never know. We only know what happened when Whitney tried to be perfect like Diana. And what happened was tragedy. The lesson for younger artists should be clear. Learn from predecessors, but don't become them. Study successful strategies, but adapt them to your personality and needs. Recognize that what worked for someone else might not work for you. Value authenticity over perfection. Choose sustainability over impossible standards. But the industry doesn't teach those lessons. Still holds up Diana as the ideal. Still expects the next generation to follow the same blueprint. Still creates conditions for the same tragedies. Diana Ross demonstrated that Black women could achieve unprecedented mainstream success. That's important and shouldn't be minimized. But Diana also demonstrated one way to achieve it, through perfection, control, suppression of authentic emotion, image management that requires constant performance. That's not the only way, shouldn't be the default template, but it became one because Diana did it first and did it successfully. Whitney learned those lessons, and those lessons contributed to Whitney's destruction. Do you think Diana's blueprint for success was harmful to Whitney Houston? Or was Whitney's tragedy about personal choices rather than industry pressures? Drop a comment, share your thoughts on perfection, authenticity, and the cost of following someone else's path to success. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another trip down memory lane.